Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Oxford University Press, I welcome you all to a conversation on our latest publication, Resurgent Asia, Diversity in Development by Deepak Nayyar. This book is an extension of our organizational mission of furthering excellence in research, scholarship, and education by publishing worldwide. We're delighted that so many of you have taken time out from your busy schedules to be with us today. Resurgent Asia provides an analytical narrative of Asia's incredible economic development, situated in the wider context of its complex historical, political, and social past. In assessing how development thinking and development outcomes in Asia have changed since Gunnar Myrdal published Asian Drama 50 years ago, the book provides a timely insight into the challenging grounds Asia finds itself in today, particularly when turbulent political changes seem to shake the corners of the world. It is as much a study of Asia's transformative past as it is a reflection on its future. Oxford University Press is a department of the University of Oxford and the largest university press in the world. We publish in 102 global languages with products that cover a broad academic and educational spectrum. We have been in India for over 100 years now and strive to strengthen the press's mission to create world-class academic and educational resources. This book by Professor Nayyar is naturally a prestigious addition to our oeuvre. Without further ado, I would now like to introduce you briefly to our distinguished panelists and request them to take their seats on the stage. We are honored to have among us today Professor Romila Thapar, who is a renowned historian and Professor Emerita at Jawaharlal Nehru University. On the panel, we have the pleasure of the company of Professor Deepankar Gupta, who's a noted sociologist and was formerly the professor in the Center for the Study of Social Systems, JNU. Professor Neerja Gopal Jayal, who's professor at the Center for the Study of Law and Governance at JNU. Professor Sudipto Mandal, who is an emeritus professor and member of the Board of Governors of the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, New Delhi. The discussion today will be moderated by Mr. Prem Shankar Jha, who's a well-known economist, journalist, and writer, and who previously served as the information advisor to the Prime Minister of India. The panelists, please take your seats on the stage. I would now request Professor Deepak Nayyar to give us a flavor of the book. Professor Nayyar is Emeritus Professor of Economics at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and an Honorary Fellow of Balliol College, Oxford. He was previously Distinguished University Professor of Economics at the New School for Social Research, New York, and has taught at the University of Oxford, the University of Sussex, and the Indian Institute of Management, Calcutta. He has also served as the Vice Chancellor of University of Delhi. Once again, I extend my warmest greetings to all of you for joining us today. Thank you.
Distinguished guests, colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen, I am touched that so many of you have found the time and made the effort to travel this distance in Delhi and be here with us this evening. I will be brief. I have spent 3 years writing this book and doing another, both of which are outside, and I will not test your patience. I just want to give you a sense of the book, what it is about. It is an audaciously ambitious book, but fools rush in where angels fear to tread. So here goes. 2 centuries ago, in 1820, Asia accounted for 2/3 of world population and almost 3/5 of world income. The subsequent decline of Asia was attributable to its integration with the world economy, shaped by colonialism and driven by imperialism. By 1970, in terms of income levels, Asia was the poorest continent in the world, poorer than Africa and much poorer than Latin America, marginal except for its large population. Its demographic and social indicators of development, literacy, life expectancy, among the worst anywhere, epitomized its underdevelopment. The deep pessimism then about Asia's economic prospects, voiced by Gunnar Myrdal in Asian Drama, published in 1968, was widespread at the time. In the half-century since then, Asia has witnessed a profound transformation in terms of economic progress of nations and living conditions of people. By 2016, it accounted for 30% of world income, 40% of world manufacturing, and one-third of world trade, while its income per capita converged towards the world average, but not towards that in industrialized countries because the initial income gap was so enormous. This transformation was unequal across countries and between people, strikingly so. Even so, predicting it 50 years ago would have required an imagination run wild. Indeed, Asia's economic transformation in this short time span is almost unprecedented in human history. Now, my book analyzes the phenomenal transformation of Asia. In doing so, it provides an analytical narrative of this remarkable story of economic development, situated in historical perspective, and an economic analysis of the underlying factors with a focus on critical issues in the process of and outcomes in development. It considers differences in initial conditions, highlights turning points in economic performance, assesses how processes of change were managed or mismanaged, discusses the influence of development strategies and economic reforms, examines changes in engagement with the world economy, explores the role of governments and politics, and analyzes the factors underlying successes, failures, or mixed outcomes in development. Now, given the size and the diversity of the Asian continent, the aggregate level is obviously not appropriate. Thus, the study disaggregates Asia into its 4 constituent subregions: East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and West Asia, and further into 14 selected countries: China, India, South Korea, Indonesia, Turkey, Taiwan, Thailand, Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Vietnam, and Sri Lanka. These countries, which I describe as the Asian 14, were listed by me in descending order of economic size as measured by national income. These countries account for more than 4/5, more than 80% of the population and income of Asia. An analysis of this resurgence of Asia, situated in its wider context of historical, political, and social factors, I believe should enhance our understanding of development processes and outcomes in Asia. It also draws analytical conclusions that contribute to contemporary debates on development and highlights lessons from the Asian experience for developing countries elsewhere to suggest how the next 25 years might unfold in Asia. Now, it is essential at the outset to recognize the diversity of Asia, which is a recurring theme in the book. There were marked differences between countries in geographical size, embedded histories, colonial legacies, nationalist movements, initial conditions, natural resource endowments, population size, income levels, and political systems. The reliance on markets and degree of openness in economies varied greatly across countries and over time. The politics, too, ranged widely from authoritarian regimes, oligarchies, to political democracies. So did ideologies, from communism through state capitalism to unbridled capitalism. Development outcomes differed across space and over time. There were different paths to development because there were no universal solutions, magic wands, or silver bullets, despite claims made by those who have ideological advocacies of a point of view. The choices made were shaped very much by the national context. Now, despite such diversity, there are discernible patterns. Economic growth drove development. Growth rates of GDP or GDP per capita in Asia were stunning and far higher than elsewhere in the world. Rising investment and savings rates combined with the spread of education were the underlying factors. Growth was driven by rapid industrialization, often but not always export-led, associated with structural changes in the composition of output and employment. It was supported by coordinated economic policies, often heterodox or unorthodox, wherever and whenever necessary across sectors. Rising per capita incomes transformed social indicators of development as literacy rates and life expectancy rose everywhere. Rapid economic growth also led to a massive reduction in absolute poverty across countries in Asia. However, the scale of absolute poverty that persists in Asia, despite this unprecedented growth, is just as striking as the sharp reduction therein. The poverty reduction could and would have been much greater but for the rising inequality. Inequality between people within countries rose almost everywhere, except South Korea and Taiwan, widening the gap not only between the top 10% and the bottom 50%, but also between the richest 1% and the remaining 99%. The gap between the richest and the poorest countries in Asia in terms of ratios of per capita income remains awesome at 100:1. Governments performed a critical role, ranging from leader to catalyst or supporter in the economic transformation of Asia, spanning half a century, while their willingness and ability to do so depended on the nature of the state, which was shaped by politics. Success at development in Asia was about managing this evolving relationship between states and markets, which I argue are complements rather than substitutes, by finding the right balance in their respective roles that also changed over time. Countries where governments could not perform this role lagged behind in development. The developmental states in South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore, which could coordinate policies across sectors over time in pursuit of national development objectives, using carrot and stick to implement their agenda, enabled them to become industrialized nations in just 50 years. China emulated these developmental states with much success, and Vietnam has followed on the same path 2 decades later, as both countries have strong one-party communist governments that could coordinate and implement policies. It is not possible, I believe, to replicate these states elsewhere in Asia, but other countries did manage to evolve some institutional arrangements, even if less effective, that were conducive to industrialization and development. Economic openness has performed a critical supportive role in Asian development, wherever it has been in the form of strategic integration with, rather than a passive insertion into, the world economy. However, analysis of the industrialization experience in the Asian 14 shows that openness, while necessary, was not sufficient. It was conducive to industrialization and development only when it was combined with industrial policy. This meant a strategic use of trade policy, exchange rate policy, monetary policy, and fiscal policy, combined with the provision of industrial finance and strategic regimes for foreign investment that facilitated industrialization. Most important, perhaps, there was a coordination of such economic policies across sectors over time. Clearly, success at industrialization in Asia was driven by sensible industrial policy that was implemented by effective governments. The countries in Asia that modified, adapted, and contextualized their reform agenda while calibrating the sequence of and the speed at which economic reforms were introduced did well. They did not hesitate to use heterodox or unorthodox policies or experiment and innovate for their national development objectives. Learning and unlearning were part of a process in which economic policies were means to the end of development. Now, the rise of Asia represents the beginnings of a shift in the balance of economic power in the world, with some erosion in the political hegemony of the West. The future will be shaped partly by how Asia exploits the opportunities and meets the challenges, and partly by how the difficult economic and political conjuncture unfolds. Yet, it is plausible to suggest that by about 2050, a century after the end of colonial rule, Asia will account for more than 1/2 of world income and will be home to more than 1/2 the people of Earth. It will thus have an economic and political significance in the world that would have been difficult to imagine 50 years ago, even if it was the reality in 1820. I'm going to stop here. This is meant to be no more than a teaser, and I hope it will tempt you to read the book. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nayyar. May I now invite Professor Romila Thapar to grace us with her insights.
Let me say at the outset that I am more than delighted to see the actual book, to see it as a three-dimensional object, because for many months now, for a few years now, we've all been talking about it, we've all been expecting it, it's been an abstraction. Now, at last, it is an object that one can see and read and gain some information from. I'm not quite sure why I was asked to release the book and to be present on this panel. I believe it's partly friendship, but I think it's also partly that some of us have been gently nudging Deepak in the last couple of years to do a little more work than he has done on economic history. And I say this because, my profession is that I'm a historian of the remote past, therefore really know nothing about the coming future. Nevertheless, I think that the brilliance with which he has written the first 2 chapters, on which I have some little tiny minute competence, has convinced me that this is someone who has to be gently told a little more economic history would be all to the point. But also, I think what is terribly important, and comes out in the book as well, is that something we forget, that there is a link between the past and the present. One could go as far as the Buddha and say that there is no present, because the moment you talk about the present, it becomes the past. But I don't think I'll go that far, because my professional expertise depends on maintaining the past and talking about the linkage. But I think the linkage is often forgotten, because when we talk about Asia, for example, in terms of the linkage, it's always restricted to religion, to culture, to things of that kind. Very few people talk about the fact that there was a relationship between the states of pre-modern Asia and the markets, and that this relationship affected every single state of pre-modern Asia. And that this is an area that we should be looking at as a kind of preliminary to the kind of things that Gunnar Myrdal and Deepak have been writing about. Gunnar Myrdal's book, which was written 50 years ago, and I still recall the tremendous discussion that went around the book when it first came out, with people talking about the possibilities that he was suggesting for what would happen in Asia. And I'm really absolutely delighted that Deepak had the guts to get up and say, right, I'll do a response, and I will do something that pulls together what has been happening and assess what has been happening. I find it very interesting that the titles of the books, Gunnar Myrdal calls his book Asian Drama. Deepak talks about Resurgent Asia. That's a giveaway of the difference of opinion that they have and the difference in the assessments that they make. The publication of Deepak's book, Resurgent Asia, marks, I think, a significant departure. Significant because historically, and this is again something that we don't sufficiently recognize, in every aspect of life, colonialism in Asia was a disjuncture. It was a break, it was a mark that made what came before very different from what came afterwards and what is to still come. Let us not forget that we are still carrying with us some of the burden of colonialism and some of the stamp of colonialism. We haven't totally thrown it aside, and in a sense, it has become embedded in our history. As Deepak said at the beginning, the Asian economy had surpassed others in the 17th and 18th centuries, and this was gradually brought not to a close, but to a subservience to European economies. And at one level, the market had triggered the colonial enterprise, and in another way, it was a changing market that was one of the factors that drew this enterprise to a close. And in hindsight now, one may say that the move towards even something like globalization also changed the units of social and economic functioning, namely the relationships between each of the states and the market. In a way, this was a logical outcome, but one can ask the question, could it have been otherwise? And this is where much of the information that comes in this book is extremely useful. In the 1970s, when Asian drama was being widely discussed, there was apprehension about the direction that Asian economies would take. Deepak's overview of what happened in the last 50 years and what this portends, it seems to me, is a more perceptive comprehension written with, of course, his usual impressive clarity. A key question that has emerged is that of how the state and the markets relate to each other in the context of the emergence of the nations of Asia. Remember, of course, that the emergence of the nation in historical terms is an absolute transformation of the society as it existed. And this transformation, what is meant by nationalism, what is meant by the emergence of a nation in terms of what was before, is a transformation which I think that we, all of us, have not yet fully grasped the significance of this transformation. The working of the market remains substantial, but extends to other activities as well. Not to mention its effect on aspects of social living. The state is not a static enterprise, as we often seem to think it is when we talk about it. It changes, as does the market. And the nature of each, of the state and the market, and the nature of the relationship between them are crucial questions which are discussed in this book. The interface of planned economies and market forces shapes the pattern of development, as is evident. And the degree to which the state intervenes takes on a political dimension. We often forget that there is also another factor involved, namely the commitment to the rights of citizens in a change to a democratic nation state. It is not just a matter of economic and technological change or a revival of what we look upon as tradition and culture. There is a large human factor, as has been emphasized in the book. How societies move towards new value systems has also to be investigated. And this is, of course, something that we are right in the middle of at the moment, with possibly not enough attention being given to analyzing why value systems are changing and the direction of the change. States and markets have not been separate entities in the history of each of these countries. Who controls economic exchange and the markets, and to what degree, has been a centuries-old problem that economic historians, even of remote periods, have had to grapple with. And since markets were never unitary and static, it was difficult to measure the degree of control by the state. Both states and markets have differed, as Deepak said, in size, histories, political systems, populations, susceptibility to immigrants, resources, and ideologies. And these are all crucial variables in at least historical readings, and also, as is clear from the book, in the future of the development of economics. That the relationship is a changing one is evident, the relationship between the state and the market, even from the perspective of where we are today. The form in which there will be human interventions in particular are unpredictable. Can Asia control the ecological mutation that it is being subjected to and in which it is participating? Effective action from India and China, for instance, may still save us from disasters. I keep thinking of things like alternative energy. If one is thinking, for example, of solar energy, it is the deserts and it is the Arctic regions that are going to become more and more important as places where this energy is going to be developed and preserved and kept. What role will these regions, hitherto regarded as backward and excluded, have in a future situation when energy changes? Changes in economic patterns have to be integrated into political democracy. And the change to democracy is not easy, as we all know, and as we have learnt and are still learning. Yet it has to be a persistent goal. And human rights and human values are central to this goal. The use of new and advanced technologies pose another set of problems, particularly as we know from history that new technologies bring about substantial and sometimes spectacular change, not always predictable and not always desirable, but sometimes allowing for a great leap forward. Iron technology, for example, in ancient times, or agricultural technology in medieval times, and of course, industrialization in the modern period. These are all part of that kind of technological change. This also means that education for further technology has to be rooted in the freedom to think and to think without limits. There has to be no restriction on the freedom to think in order to advance knowledge. Some countries, as we know, are busy reversing this exercise. Quantitative changes also make a difference, and here my example is an example that is being much talked of these days, and which I think we haven't really investigated sufficiently. The question of migration, and what effect will the large-scale migrations that are taking place today have on economies and politics, societies and cultures in the world to come. Again, in historical terms, migrations are at the root of civilizations, bringing debate and change in patterns of living and thinking. And in the present age, they problematize the change in many directions. And these may be comprehensible in terms of the change they will bring, but which possibly might be sometimes out of control. One has to also consider that problem. The challenge is not only economic, but also lies in recognizing the emergence of a new relationship, that between citizen and nation. We have to incorporate the duties and obligations of each to the other, which again is something that we haven't thought sufficiently about. When I say we, in this case, I mean many countries of Asia, and many countries of Asia that have thought about it sufficiently and have taken a certain position is a position that perhaps we are not in full agreement with. The obsession should not be with converting Uyghurs and Tibetans into Han Chinese, or, as in India, attempting to marginalize the minority communities or to deny them citizenship. The new relationship between citizen and state, which replaces that between the earlier relationship of subject and lord, has not only to be recognized, but has to register a new historical context and concept. Some old identities will have to be sloughed off. That is history. And that, again, is a question that comes up implicitly in much of what is discussed in the book. The final chapter of the book touches briefly on the shape that Asian societies may take in the future. This is the logical outcome of the earlier chapters. Will Asia remain Asia, or will it have lateral ties across continents that will change the idea of Asia, not its geography, but its idea? I would add the question of what will happen to areas currently waiting in the wings and waiting to come onto center stage, areas such as the ones I've mentioned, Central Asia, and in addition, Southeast Asia. What will be their new historical role when the source of energy and when the economic patterns and the political patterns will change? A book such as this not only comments on what has happened in the last half century, but inevitably and implicitly makes us look at what might lie in the future. The book will have cautioned us about various potentialities that may bring positive results or otherwise. We shall become familiar with the perennial questions so crucial to the long perspective into the future. It suggests some constructive ways of proceeding, and above all, we shall get to know the meaning of the optimistic slogan which underlies much of the book, that the 21st century will be the Asian century. So all I can say to conclude is thank you, Deepak, for giving us an insightful and thoughtful book that encourages incisive questions leading to effective answers.
Thank you, Professor Thapar. Could I now request you to release the book and the panelists to join her? Over to you, Mr. Cham.
May I take the privilege for the moment, at least staying seated, because I fully expect our very distinguished panelists to go and speak from there, because it will be far easier for them, among other things, to videograph it. Would that be all right? Okay. Yeah, okay. Sorry, I apologize. I hope you heard me in any case. I just said that I shall stay seated while our distinguished panelists will speak to you from there. So I'm going to just come down in this direction from Professor Sudipto Mandal onwards, because I think that it also makes sense that we go from politics from economics to politics and politics to sociology. That's the logical development, and that is precisely, in fact, what Romila mentioned, except that the one other thing that is left out, which is the historical part, she has already done. So may I now ask Sudipto, would you please start? And may I just, a few ground rules. We're going to have about 10 minutes, I hope, will be sufficient for each panelist, and I'm not going to give indications of this one. I'm going to leave it to you. And after that, we will open the thing to the floor. I would like to be able to say a few things, because I've been making notes and also a few ideas of mine from Deepak's book. If I have time, I will take 5 minutes at the end, and I hope that you will be patient enough to stay to listen to me in those 5 minutes, although I don't guarantee that it'll be worth staying for. That you'll have to decide for yourself. Thank you. Sudipto, please.
Thank you, Prem. Let me start by saying that this volume is certainly by far the most comprehensive and insightful analysis of Resurgent Asia that we have seen so far. And it is a remarkable achievement by any standards. However, to highlight exactly how remarkable it is, before coming to the book itself, I want to say a little bit about the circumstances under which it was written, something that finds only a passing mention in Deepak's preface. At the time when Deepak was writing this book, he was also directing an extremely ambitious project of WIDA, consisting of domain experts from all over the world, about more than 20 authors who were asked to write on different subjects. There were several conferences over which initial drafts were planned, they were written, they were revised, and at each stage, Deepak was very carefully sort of shepherding all this with a great deal of time being invested until the final conference happened, and the final book is now available along with this this book as a companion volume. But this was in addition to his usual involvement in the governance of a whole slew of different institutions and organizations, his membership of various committees and commissions, and of course his regular column in Mint, which he was writing. That he did suspend for a while. And most challenging of all is that throughout this period, Rohini, his wife Rohini, as many of you probably know, was for 3 or 4 years, she was really immobilized by 2 very unfortunate accidents. She was more or less confined to a wheelchair and in great suffering. And throughout this period, Deepak very carefully and attentively nursed her and cared for her. It was quite remarkable. I certainly was quite amazed with how much attention and commitment. I have rarely seen many husbands do this. And this was on top of everything else that he was doing at the time. So that this remarkable piece of work has been produced on schedule despite all these preoccupations that he has, is really quite bears witness to his exceptional discipline, his professional commitment, and his dedication to bringing out this book. And I must add that he has accomplished all of this throughout this period with his usual very cheerful disposition and a great sense of equanimity. So hats off to you, Deepak. Let me now come to the volume itself. I'm going to confine myself to asking 2 big questions that arise out of this volume. The first big question is what is left of the so-called Washington consensus in the light of this heterodox account of the resurgence of Asia. The Washington consensus, as most of you know, really, in my view, consists of three pillars. The first one is fiscal prudence and the maintenance of macroeconomic stability, low inflation, and so on. The second is that you have a government which is committed to open markets and free trade and so on, and not trying to restrict the engagement of a country with the rest of the world. The third, and in my view very important pillar, is a minimalist capitalist state, sort of the night watchman role, where the state limits itself to maintain the rule of law, security, and the maintenance of private property rights without interfering in the free play of the market. These, I think, are, in my view, the three main pillars. And what I'm going to do now is see how much of this actually survives the research that is reproduced in this volume. Now, in chapter 3, which is on the macroeconomics of growth in the Asian experience, there's a suggestion that most of these Asian countries, I'm particularly referring to the most successful ones in East Asia, but it also includes Singapore, which is in Southeast Asia, that they did not attach a particularly high priority to fiscal prudence, maintaining low fiscal deficits and so on, or to maintaining low rates of inflation, or what I call macroeconomic stability. Now, I looked carefully at that chapter, and I must say I did not find much evidence to support that conclusion. And my own reading of these countries is that, in fact, they were all fiscally extremely prudent and committed to maintaining macroeconomic stability, except when they were hit by shocks like the Asian financial crisis and so on. And this is what sets them out in great contrast to the Latin American countries, which were fiscally profligate and went through long bouts of high inflation and hyperinflation and so on. So in my view, the record of this experience, actually that first pillar of the Washington consensus survives the East Asian experience in particular. The second pillar, openness, commitment to free trade and so on, the second pillar of the Washington consensus. I think the book documents very carefully, particularly in chapter 3, how these, particularly the miracle economies of East Asia, were highly dedicated and committed to maintaining open markets and open trade. In fact, they were mostly, a lot of them were led by both domestic investment and external exports growth. And in fact, today, ever since the great financial crisis of 2008, when we are in an environment of increasing protectionism, especially in the advanced countries who were actually the flag bearers and cheerleaders of free and open markets, it is these countries of Asia who have now emerged as the champions of free and open trade. So I think this second pillar of the Washington consensus also survives the East Asian experience. Asian experience, but particularly reference to East Asia because they were the most successful as recorded in this book. Now the third pillar, I think the minimalist idea of a minimalist state is what is the big casualty of the East Asian experience. And despite much effort from global institutions which built up the Washington consensus and they produced a document called the East Asian Miracle and so on, what has become clear is that these states were all highly interventionist developmental states. They used the market when it suited them as instruments to discipline the behavior of individual entrepreneurs and agents using a stick and carrot mechanism as Deepak described it. And that is at complete variance with the Washington consensus, the idea of a minimalist state, and so on. So that, I think, sort of, completely destroys that foundation of that particular view of what is good for development. The second big question I want to ask is about the highly varied or differential performance across Asia. And this is again something the book emphasizes, Deepak also emphasized it, that while all these countries of Asia, whether it's in East Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia, they all rose, there were vastly different difference in their performance. Now, the fact that after having from 1820 to about 1960 or the 60s, it bottomed out. The share of this region came down from about 60% to hardly 15% of global GDP. And then after that started rising, but at very different rates. That resurgence, I think, as Romila mentioned, we can understand because it was the taking off the colonial damper on the performance of these countries. We had been articulated to the interests of the colonial metropolitan countries rather than the internal dynamic. When that changed and these developmental states took over, you found this great resurgence happening. But why this big difference? That, I think, to me is a very interesting question. Why the difference particularly between East Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia, which has been the big laggard in this whole region? Of course, the individual country differences, which I'm not now going into. In my paper, in that companion volume on Asian trans, which is there, I used the taxonomy of the character of these states, which I found was pretty robust in explaining the differences in these performances on questions of issues of education health, which is what I was looking at. And I then classified these states in terms of character into what I called hard developmental states, soft developmental states, inclusive states, and predatory states. Now, I will not go into the details of this, I just don't have the time for it, except to say that it is, in my view, this taxonomy can apply much beyond just social development into economic development experience in general of this region. Of course, I must add the qualification, which again Romila mentioned, that the character of states change. They are, first of all, the products of history, and they end up changing because of contemporary circumstances. And while some of these hard developmental states, you know what I'm referring to, may have performed better than some other states, they can morph into soft states in due course. They might become what I call inclusive states. Japan, which used to be a hard state once upon a time, is today an inclusive state. The same goes for a country like South Korea. But they can also deteriorate into what you call predatory states, who are not interested in development at all, but just in appropriating profit for the interests of narrow elites. And I can think of examples like, say, Myanmar or Pakistan or Cambodia, which would fit that description. So we don't know which way things will go. But I think this is a very interesting question that arises from the record of Asian resurgence, which has been captured by Deepak so elegantly in this book. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this discussion on a really important book. The preface to Myrdal's Asian drama has a reference to a Latin phrase which apparently translates as books have their own destiny. And Asian drama was destined to become a classic of development economics, as it turned out. This book, in its critical engagement with Myrdal's work, or at least taking Myrdal's work as its point of departure, is, I think, a really fitting tribute, and I hope this too will find a similar destiny. You've already heard a lot about the fact that this is a very comprehensive overview of economic development across Asia. as has already been mentioned by Professor Thapar, this has a historical perspective which is quite rare, I think, in books on economic development. And like Myrdal's work, so unlike Myrdal's work, which was not historical, but like Myrdal's work, it recognizes that the economy is located in a larger social, political, and cultural ecosystem. The balance between states and markets, which we've been talking about for the last half an hour, being a central concern, both in Myrdal's work as well as in this book. And that's what I want to start my remarks with. Myrdal's pessimism about development in Asia came from his view that though state planning was important, what he famously called soft states were too weak to be able to resist powerful interests in their pursuit of developmental objectives. Professor Nayyar's book shows that the economic role of the state was critical in the transformation of Asia, but he emphasizes, as he said in his opening remarks, the complementarity between states and markets, and he parses different forms of state intervention that he calls functional, institutional, and strategic. Now, as we all know, the states that were most successful in economic development, South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore, were those where the hand of the state was most visible. However, the hand of the state was similarly visible in many other countries, including India and its neighbors, but the outcomes were not the same here. Some of these countries sort of muddled through, others performed quite poorly. And this difference has typically been analyzed in terms of the relationship between economic development on the one hand and regime type on the other. Regime type, generally speaking, is collapsed into two categories, democracy and authoritarianism, though of course we know there are hybrids everywhere. But the scholarship on this subject has not, for 2 decades, yielded any unambiguous conclusions about this relationship between democracy and development, or authoritarianism and development. Because for every authoritarian or even quasi-democratic state that has been effective at enabling development, there have been many more authoritarian states that have been hopeless at development. So if regime type was indeed a good predictor of development, then South Korea would be in the company, unlikely of course, in the company of Zaire or Nigeria, which clearly doesn't make sense. What the Asian experience then compels us to do is to confront the beast that was the successful developmental state, with its small developmental elite of politicians, of civil and military bureaucracy, a very powerful, very competent, insulated economic bureaucracy, its relative autonomy from special interests, but also its crushing of civil society and its often brutal repression of civil rights. These were the elements that made up the foundation on which the spectacular successes of developmental states were built. A success that came at a significant cost for liberty and human rights, despite sort of, progressive or some tendencies at least towards inclusion, as Sudipto just mentioned. It is not a pretty story, historically. It is not a pretty story, even though it is a successful one, and it leaves us with an enduring sense of discomfort about how developmental choices should be made, might be made. Should the developmental state of the 21st century, for instance, be a different sort, perhaps what some people have called a human developmental state? How might it bring together, say, something like the capability approach, along with new growth theories which emphasize ideas and knowledge production and services related to these rather than manufacturing? How might it deal with issues of climate change? Among the suggestions for ways forward, we have heard dialogical democracy, we've heard about deliberative development, but perhaps if we had tried to foster, and this is speculative, if we had tried to foster more democratically informed forms of development with a lighter ecological footprint, might it be possible that we would not have been in the present populist moment? Present-day challenges of climate change, present-day challenges of inequality have led, in fact, Professor Stiglitz, a collaborator of Professor Nayyar on many works, to declare just the other day that it is time to retire metrics like the GDP. So how might we begin a conversation about a broader idea of social progress, and how might this story of a resurgent Asia fit into that framework? Should we now consider evaluating these very developmental successes and failures using a different yardstick? I'll just make a couple of additional points. What is missing in both Asian drama and Resurgent Asia is some recognition of a third actor, namely civil society. When Myrdal wrote, of course, civil society had not emerged to become the force that it became by the 1980s, when it eventually came to challenge the neoliberal orthodoxy of market-driven development. In the success stories of Resurgent Asia, civil society was systematically neutralized as inconvenient. But it found a place at the same time in the scholarship on development, not macroeconomic scholarship, obviously, but on development, through the concepts of state-society synergy, co-production of development, and other things theorized by people like Peter Evans, and case studies by Eleanor Ostrom and Judith Tendler, among others. But of course, as I said, this was not about macroeconomics, nor was it limited to thinking about development only as economic growth. I was left wondering on reading this book whether this was completely missing from Asia, or whether there were experiences of this kind that we could perhaps draw upon. One of the ingredients of the success of developmental states in East Asia, as Professor Nayyar records, was their effectiveness in human capital formation. On the one hand, they brutally suppressed civil rights, of course, but on the other hand, they gained tremendous legitimacy through their success in delivering developmental goods. So the benefits of high growth were distributed, fairly widely distributed. They were serious about, and they were good at, building schools and health centers and roads and other public facilities to an expanding circle of people, which is not to say that inequality was overcome, but at least basic provision, social provisioning was assured. And this form of welfare, which in my line of work is known as productivist welfare capitalism, is not animated by the idea that human development is a good thing in itself, that it enables the achievement of what Sen and Nussbaum have called human capabilities or human flourishings and so on, only that it is an essential condition for economic growth. It is welfare in that framework. Welfare is instrumentally important insofar as it is conducive to productivity, and hence education, health, housing, etc. for all. It's almost a Marxist argument. This book provokes the curiosity, not only as to how different Asian countries negotiated the question of welfare, but also the place of welfare in a future developmental state that can address the imperatives of economic growth along with those of human development. In our own country, of course, needless to say, we don't seem to want to work towards either of those imperatives, even though, and it was not all that long ago, that we were promised empowerment as a superior option to entitlement, entitlements being subsidies, handouts, Manrega, etc. I'm not very clear what happened to that noble objective, but the current discourse, certainly on education, suggests that it is no longer seen as a public good. I was therefore delighted, more than delighted, to see more than a passing mention of education in this book. It was interesting to learn how education has worked as a driver of economic growth across Asia, and I think not enough has been written about this. Caveat, of course, that education as an intrinsic good is different from skill development, which can probably drive economic growth to the limited extent of providing us with a skilled labor force, but not in terms of serious technological innovation or cutting-edge R&D. Professor Nayyar attributes the increase in growth rates in post-colonial Asia, especially East Asia and Southeast Asia, partly to the spread of education. These countries, which they concentrated on primary education as the base, and later followed up on higher education, which he says was the right approach, whereas India concentrated on higher education to the detriment of primary education. Now, in India, we recognize that there was, in the early years after independence, an overwhelming emphasis on institutions of higher education being set up, from the IITs, then later the IIMs, the nuclear science establishment, and so on. But of course, since primary education was not widely enough available, and public higher education institutions were slow to expand, clearly access was limited. Nevertheless, there were, we are told, fairly large numbers of, and I'm leaving out doctors here, but engineers and scientists being trained at public cost. And the fact that they were seeking greener pastures overseas was, even in the pages of the EPW, presumed to be motivated by personal greed. I refer to an article by Professor Dandekar in the late 60s. Given what was going on in East Asia, how might we account for the lack of absorption of these highly skilled individuals in the growing economy, even if it was largely a public sector economy, the economy of manufacture and industry in this country? So I've enjoyed reading this book very much. I was very daunted by it when I started because, obviously I have zero competence in economics, but I've enjoyed and I've learned a great deal from it, just these few questions that I thought I'd share with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be with my fellow panelists, and I'm glad Deepak asked me to be a speaker here because I learned a lot from the book. Several years ago, a very well-known professor and a dear friend of mine, he was indeed my teacher as well. He became a dear friend because of his magnanimity towards me. He once wrote an important book, and he asked me to read it and tell me my views on the book. I read the book. It was difficult reading, and when he asked me about it, I said it was painful reading. And he said it was painful for me to write, so it should be painful for you to read. That was his response. So when Deepak took 3 years to write, I thought I might take 3 years to read. Fortunately, that didn't happen. I read his book in 2 days flat, and I enjoyed it a lot. In fact, I won't say it's bedtime reading, but in many ways, it is a page turner. And I think Deepak should be congratulated for that. In addition, I must also say that while reading the book, I kept thinking about India and where is India? Because Resurgent Asia, one expects India to figure prominently. And yes, we've heard about Asia, but India is a giant and you should talk about India. And India does figure, but not figure in the way in which I had thought it would. It is between the lines, and you must read the book carefully, and when you do that, it pops up like a pop-up book. It's what some advanced structural theorists might say an absent presence. If you don't understand what it means, don't worry, nobody does. So it was an absent presence that came up. I could realize that this is very important. These are the facts. If I know about the international agenda of economic growth and the Asian one too, I can place India very easily. So that was what I really found very interesting. And I felt to myself that this is something that doesn't come to us normally. We read about India, we get obsessed about India, and we stay there. And it reminded me of Rudyard Kipling, who said, what do they know of England who only England know? So I think likewise, what do they know of India who only India know? And thank you, Deepak, for opening the windows for me. And then when I kept reading his book, I found that the world, of course, was important, and Asia was important, but my God, East Asia was tremendous in its impact on Asian development. Deepak did mention to you about the giant strides Asia took in terms of GDP contribution to the world. But what he should have also mentioned, he did mention in the book, that 2/3 of it is because of China. And that's very important. And we must understand that. In addition, I might also throw in this bit from the World Bank reports that 70% of the world's reduction in poverty is because of China. So we must pay attention to what China did. And what Deepak does very well in the book is to tell us time and time again, something he didn't say today out of modesty, I suppose, that you cannot really talk of economic growth in terms of single factors or a bunch of single factors, but in terms of cumulative response and cumulative collection of facts that come together to make for a certain outcome. And that cumulative facts are very, very important. Accumulation of facts is very important. And this is what he talks about in great detail. And towards the end of the book, it comes a little more openly, and you can see India there all the way, even though it's not always mentioned quite as clearly. China produces 1/7 or India produces 1/7 of the cars China produces. India produces 1/8 of the steel China produces. India produces 1/10 of the cement that China produces. Now, why should that be the case? What's the matter? In the 1950s and 60s, we were all children in kindergarten. We were all scrabbling around. We had high infant mortality rates, low age expectancy, very low productivity, low literacy rates. And then we stayed there, or we moved slowly, of course, but not fast enough. And yet you have another country, a neighbor of ours, and a few others with it, who have really taken gigantic strides. How did they manage that? What did they put in effect that we couldn't do? If you were to look at, say, and Deepak does refer to it, Kuznets and Madison and so forth, they say, West was always developed, and we took off, therefore we took off rather well, and you people out there just chew on it and be quiet. But then why did the Asian drama not work from 1960 or 1970 onwards? If you look at the GDP per capita, that Deepak writes about, the difference between 1970, later post-1970 China and pre-1970 China is immense. The difference between pre-1960 India and post-1970 India is still roughly the same. Why is that the case? And I think that's the case because we haven't taken into account this cumulative impact that we should have paid attention to. And towards the later part of his book, he does talk about it in some detail, and he says that this is a very important point he makes, we in India, he didn't say India, of course, but he said India's there hovering like a specter. He said that there's a difference between strategic thinking and crisis thinking. And India really came alive to me because we don't do strategic thinking, we do crisis thinking, crisis management. Even 1991 was a crisis management. Today we laud it as a great economic innovation, but it was a crisis management really. On all other aspects, if you take Lewis and Caldo together, you will find that we seem to be following the traditional path. Agriculture contributes less and less to the total GDP, which it did in the Indian case, from 50% 1950 or thereabouts to about 13% today. A large number of people are leaving villages for the city and leaving villages for other villages as well. Professor Thapa talked about migration. It's a very important thing. 37% of Indians today here are migrants. 37% of them. And don't you think that only poor people migrate? In fact, the better off people migrate more than the poorer people. The graduates, 38% of graduates migrate, 17% of illiterates migrate. That lowest 10th decile, 10%, the highest 10th decile, 46%. So people want to go, want to do something. In a village, most young village boys are bouncing on a kind of a country-made rude tarpaulin, hoping to see the world outside and not quite getting there, hoping to catch the eye of somebody and go away. It is not always happening. Not just the boys, their parents too don't want the children to be there. Migration is happening everywhere in India. Migration, rich and poor are both migrating. But the important point is the poor are much more adventurous. They are migrating large distances. If you go to a place like Tirupur, you'll be shocked. There are so many people from Jharkhand, from Bengal, and from Bihar over there. In the 1990s, Tirupur was largely staffed by workers from that region. Today, they're coming from all over India, everywhere. And this is what is happening. According to the Indian railway figures, 5 billion railway tickets are sold every year. 5 billion, which is more than 3 times the population of our country. And of course, you must also add to it the number of people who travel ticketless. And you'll know how many people are actually traveling. So people want to move, people are looking for opportunities, they want to get away. And what is this new India that we're not actually supporting? The new India is made up of job seekers and employment seekers, and education seekers primarily. Look at the education figures. I mean, we talk about China and East Asia doing certain things like education and health, in spite of the fact it's a dictatorial society, a communist society, or whatever, but the impact is really important. Do you think Indians don't want to be educated? Wrong. They want to be educated. They're trying very hard to be educated. Even in tertiary education, the last 10 years has jumped from 11% to 29%. In secondary education, from 58% to 90%. 95% of children at the age of 6 and 14 are enrolled. But 42% of those enrolled are working. They cannot study full time. And most of them are working in agriculture. And we know from the same report, the ASO report, for example, that only 1.2% want to be agriculturists. Others don't want to be agriculturists. So what do they want to be? Carpenters, electricians? No. Plumbers? No. Only 5% of people want to be plumbers, electricians, carpenters. 74% say, we want to be graduates. And why do they want to be graduates? Because after they get an ITI degree, after they get a degree in a vocational firm, vocational school, they don't get a job. If you don't get a job, then what's the point in having a degree from ITI or some other vocational school? Why not be a graduate? At least you can boast about it and say, I'm a graduate. What's the point of getting a degree in vocational training and not getting anywhere? In fact, when we talk about the service sector in our country, we should actually be talking about the servant sector. It's not really a service sector as in the West. Do you know the 9 most available jobs in India? It's not the 9 most sought after jobs in India. But the most available jobs in India, 31% construction, 17% retail, 13% transport, 10%, yes, beauty parlors and so forth, 8% furniture, 7% textile, 6 handloom, 5 domestic, 5 security. Now, why do you need to have a vocational training to do any of these? You don't need that at all. You can just walk into it. In fact, if you go to these factories in India, including those that make car parts, you'll find that most of them have workers who are semi-skilled, and their skill sets can be imparted to them within 3 to 4 weeks, maybe maximum 2 months. That's about it. And this is because the machines they work on are not the machines we make. These machines don't make a mistake, and these machines are from Germany, Japan, and increasingly China. A quotation I like to tell everybody is from Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett said, I like to invest in industries that make machines that China wants to buy. And why is that so? Because if China wants to buy the machine, it must be really good, because China is making most of the machines themselves. Now, this is the education front. What's the point of being educated if this is the kind of jobs I'm going to get? But that does not mean I don't want to be educated. As I gave you the figures earlier, they want to be educated. There's a huge desire for education. But then that takes them nowhere, which basically means that now we must add on, as Deepak did suggest, to the Kaldor-Lewis hypothesis, that now we must add on and say, let's increase productivity. Because you see, export by itself doesn't really work. And most of us know from the daily newspapers and elsewhere that people have the silver bullet. No country can develop without exports. Sounds very good. But the follow-up is really tough, and we must pay attention to the follow-up. And the follow-up is, it must be accompanied with high productivity. That is very important, and that is not happening. Why is it not happening? Because we are still depending on a cottagey kind of atmosphere. We're still depending on MSME, micro, small, and medium enterprises. Now, micro, small, and medium enterprises won't get you very far. Of course, it does satisfy some of the Gandhian compulsions people have, and Article 40 to some extent, but it doesn't take you very far. It doesn't increase skill sets, it doesn't increase productivity, it doesn't even help very much in terms of employment. But even if employment grows, just imagine what kind of employment. You had 38 million micro MSME in 2010. 38 million, employing 59 million people. And now you have 58 million employing 118 million people. That is, on an average, one MSME employs 2.3 people. That's about it. 95% of MSMEs employ less than 5 people. MSME's contribution to GDP has gone down from 7.7% to 7%, in spite of the increase in employment. MSMEs, in terms of total numbers, have gone up from 38 to 59 million. Number of people employed has also gone up, but the contribution to GDP has gone down. The contribution to the manufacturing sector has gone down from 42.06 to 37.3. So what's the point of putting all your eggs in the MSME basket? Now, the Asian drama was a drama which was probably a tragedy because everybody played according to the rules. If you look at Greek tragedy, it's simply because everybody is doing what is supposed to be done. And I think the soft state was a soft state because the soft state didn't dare do anything unusual, take a dramatic step. And those states that dared to do something daring have succeeded. And therefore, I think Deepak's book is very important because Asian drama is a tragedy, a drama, good drama nevertheless, but it's trying to move on into something novel. Thank you, Deepak.
Thank you, Deepankar. Let me just, a little bit of timing. We normally finish at 8, but we started a little late, so we're going to go until about 10 past 8. I think we have 15 to 20 minutes perhaps for talk, for questions, and I'd like to have 5 minutes my final say. I came back early from the States for that, and I don't want to miss it. May I just do one thing though? I don't want to go through this question by question. This has been an extremely erudite discussion, and what I would like to do is, can we just have about, say, 6 questions, from the floor, and if you can make notes of it, and anyone replies and also interacts, and I think that we will be able to then complete this comfortably by about 5 past 8 or 10 past 8 at the latest. Thank you very much. So, questions now, please. Would anybody like to raise their hands and start the thing going, the ball rolling?
Otherwise.
Okay, that's one question. Another question, any more questions? Yes? Yes.
I don't think it's appropriate to ask a question about the book about which I had only had a cursory glance. But nonetheless, let me ask a question which I think might have been addressed in the book at the later pages. Professor Nayyar, I would like to know from you that this resurgence of Asia story which you're trying to say, I fear might be at a different turning point in the post-global financial crisis period, where we are finding that there's a large inundation of portfolio capital flows happening from the developed countries towards the Asian side, creating a bubble of sorts also in the region, which could also have consequences. And do you have any sort of skepticism relating to the same? Might be it's already addressed in the book.
Here and here, there are 2 people.
Thank you. My question is to Professor Jayal. Professor Jayal, you've been giving this large trajectory to the developmental state, and you've been also getting into this very hybrid concepts like productivist welfare, capitalism, so on and so forth. Now, I work at the Central University of South Bihar, and I see how these, large-scale framings really work on the ground when you talk about these fancy programs like skill development on one hand, and entrepreneurship development. Now, do you find somewhere that there is, on the other hand, the factory, the raw material which goes into this, making the so-called skill development and entrepreneurship development, are half-baked. That people don't know basic literacy, count arithmetic, and forget about the general knowledge. Now, and then you have this, and you put in a lot of promise about the civil society or the third sector to really bring us out, which you think has been left out by the state and the market discussion. But are you really very sure that the civil society has any role to play in this kind of morphed entrepreneurship or morphed skill development that we are looking at? How far do you think civil society can really help us in this kind of a sector?
Yeah.
Is there any reason that in this entire area of East Asia, how is it that for this entire resurgence, there is almost a 70-year span or 80-year span of time that Japan develops a lot before and continues to develop, and then the other parts of East Asia, and then finally China? And how will this unfold from here on? But my question is more particularly, why this 70 to 90 years? Is it destiny or is it just chance? Or?
Any other questions? There's a lady and there's Manishankar here. And there's one more person. I think we should stop there, if you don't mind.
My question is for Professor Nayyar. Even though I have not read the book, but the comments from all the panelists gives an insight, and I think it's not too little that I know about the book that I cannot place a question. My question is very simple. Do you think that to some extent interdependence has been a factor in this process or in this resurgent Asia that you talk about? And to what extent?
And here, Mr. Iyer here, please, in front row. Here, Mr. Manishankar here.
My question is addressed to Professor Jayal. It was at a time when I was working very closely with her that it was clear that empowerment is fundamental to development, whereas entitlement is fundamental to human welfare at any given point in time. And as you rightly mentioned, this business of empowerment has gone out of our vocabulary. But from what I've compared of local government in India and in China, they have decentralized so much of their administration to perhaps unelected, in our sense of the term, local bodies. But they put these local bodies in charge of moving things, and we never succeeded in putting our local bodies in charge of things. So fundamentally, is it because they are racially superior to us that they've done so much better? Or is it that they have understood, despite being authoritarian regimes, that the answer lies in decentralizing, in making democracy a participatory process and not just a representative process as we have here in India? Is that why the failure of Panchayati Raj responsible for the argument between empowerment and entitlement, which was so much in the forefront about 10, 15 years ago, having virtually disappeared now, and thereby damned our prospects for the future?
Is there, I'll take one more question if there's anyone left. Well, two. I've seen two hands. I'm going to give you, both of you, and the lady in front and the gentleman at the back, and then we will get answers. And
it's how does collectivism versus individualism ties into the development, whether or not it succeeds? I was interested. Yeah, like clientelism is also, I think, connected to a kind of a collective society. So I was wondering whether that is hampering or propelling the development.
Collectivism. How is collectivism hampering
yeah.
or individualism doing one or the other? Okay.
Yeah.
And behind the gentleman in the red shirt.
Given what's happening in the United States, thanks to Mr. Trump, but also many of the Democratic candidates being increasingly nervous about globalization, also Brexit. So is the time of globalization over? And if so, do we need a new paradigm going forward? What's happened in the past is basically over. If so, what are the possibilities for the future?
Okay, thank you very much. We got, yes?
I think Hamid has a very important point.
Well,
she's shy of making.
Would you, Mr. Vice President, sir, would you kindly ask us the question?
No, I was wondering if Confucian ethics has anything to do with comparative performances.
All right, we've got excellent questions. Thank you very much. Okay. Who would like to start? Deepak, I think you said that you had some specific things that you want. Shall we just go down this way? Or please, would anyone start, please? And I can push my chair back.
Maybe, Asia, briefly, you had a couple of questions addressed directly to you, and then I can, yeah.
Okay, sure.
So sorry, young man from my university, I presume, since you're wearing a sweatshirt. You know, there were like 3 or 4 different questions embedded in that, in what you said. I don't know very much about how skill development and entrepreneurship development in rural Bihar is being implemented. I don't know anything about it. But as far as the question of civil society is concerned, there was a time in this country when even planning exercises used to take civil society seriously. I think from the 8th plan onwards, if I'm not mistaken, the civil society sector was actually incorporated in the planning, in visions for planning and the implementation of planning, even if that was mainly taking on tasks of, you know, delivering welfare services rather than development in any other sense. But there was an effort to include NGOs as partners in development. And this is actually, whether it succeeded or not is another matter. Most of the time it was simply franchising out of services, for instance, education in the DPEP programs and so on. But across the world, in the literature on development, state, markets, and civil society, the interaction between these three has been a central theme in writings on development from the 90s onwards. And there are experiences across the world, Brazil, Nigeria, and many other countries. Some people have even worked in this vein on Kerala, suggesting that civil society does have and can have a constructive role to play in development. The actual reality of our NGO participation in development being a separate issue, but theoretically, there has been this strand of literature. I'm happy to tell you more about it. Mr. Nayyar, that's an impossible question. You know the answer better than I do. I'm tempted to say they are racially superior, but I won't because for obvious reasons. I'm not convinced that unelected decentralization is necessarily a good thing. You would have to convince me about that. And of course, we do live in an era of centralization, and China is as centralized as any other country, if not more, from what I understand. So I don't think this decentralization to which you refer is actually substantive decentralization in any real sense. It is more like administrative decentralization rather than democratic decentralization. And there is a distinction between those two, is there not? Right? Thank you.
I have 2 constraints. Time and patience are both exhaustible resources, and that is important. And second, Prem has flown all the way from Harvard earlier than he would have for this evening. So I do want him to have the last word for 5 minutes. I have learned from and enjoyed all the comments that were made by the panelists. They have been very, very good. There is no way I can address all the questions that were raised. But let me address a question that is important, which was raised by Nirja, that I do not pay sufficient attention to civil society. Perhaps not in a quantitative sense, but in a qualitative sense I do. Because the essential argument I develop in the book is that developmental states, which we have seen in South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore, were an outcome of both a colonial legacy and a political conjuncture. China and Vietnam are developmental states that mimic these, but we cannot reproduce them. Now, essentially, in countries that do not have developmental states, and that is India, as a prime example, which Sudipta would call soft and predatory sometimes, I argue, not just in India, but elsewhere too, that political democracy is the only thing that provides checks and balances in these societies, which make governments more development-oriented and more people-friendly. And in that, it is not just the state institutions, the non-government institutions of the state, but civil society and the media play a very important role. Now, in this dimension, India is way ahead of the other Asian countries, and yet it has not managed to function. Deepankar said, where is India? India is larger than life. I don't always mention it. but it is the laggard in almost every sense of the word, with the exception of its spectacular growth story from 1991 to 2016, which is petering out. Sudipto and I disagreed just a little. I think he agrees with me that the third pillar of the Washington consensus of the state as a night watchman has no leg to stand on. I also think if you look at the East Asian experience in particular, the Washington consensus of idea of openness is completely wrong. And I'm not the only one. There are many people like Alice Amston, Robert Wade, Hajun Chang who argued that. But you and I will continue to discuss this. The question that Krishna Kumar asked, it's discussed at length in the book. In Asian economic development, non-debt creating capital flows, which was direct foreign investment, played a strategic role where it was used effectively. However, capital account liberalization, sort of volatile short-term portfolio investment flows were detrimental to development almost everywhere, so much so that East Asia and Southeast Asia have never recovered their growth momentum since the Asian financial crisis. And that includes, Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia are real casualties, but even South Korea and Taiwan slowed down significantly and have not quite recovered. Japan, I should say very briefly, is the last of the early industrializers. It started in 1968. By 1914, it was an industrialized country. So it was much like Germany and France and the United States. Now, the Southeast Asian countries have actually followed the Japanese model. The East Asian model is the Japanese model. And by the way, so is China after 1980. The first people that Deng Xiaoping went to see was Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, and he went to Japan. What can we learn from you? So Japan has been the role model for all these countries, so it looms larger than life through the book in that sense. Money, I think we need to make that distinction, and I also do want to address Mr. Ansari's question. It is not about Confucian ethics. It is not about cultures. I don't believe that human beings are different. If you read Edgar Snow, who wrote about China in the 1930s, he dismisses them as opium eaters. Even worse than Mirdal dismissed India. Much worse. So I think societies are capable of changing themselves. What brings about this change has something to do with history, with society, with culture, and with politics. And that politics, I think, is in command. It plays a galvanizing role. But China is a strange dichotomy. In terms of politics, it is excessive centralization. Not a leaf stirs in China. But in economics, there is decentralization. Okay? So there's no political devolution in China. It is just economic devolution, also under close monitoring. It is what Sudipto described as a hard developmental state. It is driven by national development objectives, overriding other concerns. Last, is globalization under stress? It is. I actually discussed this in the last chapter of the book, that, Asia underwent this profound transformation in 25 years when the world was a different place. Economic growth was rapid, capital flows were abundant, economies were growing rapidly, so was international trade. It was a benevolent, indeed supportive environment for Asia to grow. However, the political conjuncture has changed dramatically with the resurgent nationalisms in the West, but also in Asia. Now, I think there is an irony in this unfolding reality that, the resurgent nationalisms and the political backlash in the industrialized countries are, I think, partly attributable to the rise of Asia. Ironically enough, the resurgent nationalisms and the political backlash in Asia is attributable to the rising inequalities that have been associated with this process of development. Globalization is indeed, I have argued elsewhere and in this book, under stress. But, you know, in 1970, everybody was deeply pessimistic about Asia because it was a very unfavorable international economic environment. Much will depend on how Asia meets these economic challenges and political challenges. It is possible because Asia has, most countries have large enough domestic markets not to be so dependent on the world. Okay, now it's time for me to stop, so Prem can have his 5 minutes. I'd be happy to answer any questions that people have if they have patience to stay afterwards.
Thank you, Deepak, and thank you for your patience for staying these extra 5 minutes. I have one, I think, an important point to make. I, in fact, mentioned it to Deepak earlier this afternoon. As one subject here which has not been dealt with, it is part of one chapter in Deepak's book deals with it, but it is, I think, the most crucial thing in understanding all the contradictions that we have been hearing about today, hard versus soft state, you know, Washington consensus versus autonomous planning, democracy versus authoritarianism, etc. And, you know, and also it's very important, this thing is very important, this factor is very important in understanding why within Asia there are such terrible laggards and also such fantastic successes. Because this is quite true, that if you look at the Asian resurgence and you look at, you disaggregate it as Deepak has done, you see that about 90% of that resurgence is in East and Southeast Asia. We had a small spurt of it and we failed, and I think we should also understand why. And so what I'm just going to tell you now is about why we have not been able to succeed and why others have. The crucial element in all industrialization and development and in the rise of capitalism itself is technology. That technology was responsible, fossil fuel-based technology was responsible for the tremendous growth of Europe after let's say 1800, has been pointed out already. In an earlier book that Deepak wrote, you know, he points out, and I have also, others have done it many times, that actually the rise of Europe didn't begin with the steam engine or the spinning jenny. It started 700-800 years earlier with the harnessing of wind power and water power in the southern German Flanders area of northern Europe. And it is the increased productivity in that till then very poor area which suddenly began to develop vast amounts of surpluses that created towns, markets, and trade, and a great deal of sort of stress on maritime development. That maritime development, in turn, was aided by two other pieces of technology. One was the lateen sail, which the Northern Europeans got from the Arabs, and the second was the compass. And these two together enabled them to leave the Mediterranean and to then start traveling all over the world, and that was the beginning of colonialism and the colonial exploitation we have today. So let us not underestimate the importance of technology. It is crucial. Everything that's happened here is the product of the human brain, then applied on the ground. And it's whether the application has been successful or unsuccessful, whether the state apparatus has been tuned into the importance of this application, that is what, or not, that is what has determined both the Asian resurgence in itself as well as the differences within it. Now, one last thing before I come to this, I just want to ask you one question. Somewhere, I think around about 1793 or something, in Manchester or somewhere, James Watt was a chap who was, you know, sort of playing around with steam and metals and so on. And he called in a bunch of friends and said, look, I've got a steam engine going. And then I don't know what they said to him or what they didn't say, but the point is, whoever saw them first, did any one of them even dream that this one innovation was going to make Britain master of 1/4 of the globe within 100 years, 120 years? Could anyone have imagined that? That is the power of technology. And that is what we have failed to capture in India. And I think that this is what we have to understand. What was the opportunity from which Asian resurgence took place? It was actually the implosion of the tremendous technological burst which had created the first industrial revolution and the era of nation-state capitalism. That was that because of the walls of the nation-state and the productivity that was being developed through their technologies, they were able to keep the profits within and to increase the average level of income to the point where the wage rates in the industrialized countries became so much higher than wage rates in the now educating themselves Southeast Asian countries, where human capital was important right from the start, that it became possible to move your entire production to a Southeast Asian country and bring it back and sell it in your home markets in Europe and America more cheaply than you could produce it in Europe and America. So that was the opportunity, the gateway that was opened, and it is the success or failure in being able to exploit this market opportunity that created the Asian resurgence. And in that, the capacity of the government to capture those technologies which had already been developed in the West and to improve upon them and to take advantage of their low wage rates at the same time to build their industrial structures, that capacity determined who succeeded and who failed. And if you look at all the questions that have been asked from there and that have been raised from the panel, you will see that this one factor determines everything. I will not just come to India and say why we are a laggard. We are a laggard because in our country, the political economic structure that we created was one that is totally adverse to technology. In Japan, you had MITI, the Ministry of Industrial Trade and Technology, Industry, Technology and something else, which went out even after the war and systematically pillaged the university research materials of all the great universities in the world. Wherever they found something, a technology that was developing, they were there to finance it. They were there to finance government companies in Japan who were prepared to go join that laboratory or that research establishment or that infant firm and to bring the technology to fruition. And they were prepared to pay. This I've been told by a top person in a Japanese company. He said, we billed MITI 3 times as much as we would bill you for this technology. But because we knew they would pay. Money was not an object. Korea did exactly the same thing, but they had a deputy prime minister, and a man who was there for 15 years running in the key breakthrough period of Korea. And the deputy prime minister's office, which dealt with technology, was more important than the prime minister's office. When I went there in 1985 and spent 10 days there, this was told to me repeatedly. So the technology is critical. In India, what happened is that we have developed a system of, first of all, corruption in politics, enforcing corruption within the bureaucracy, and that corruption becoming an element, the kickback element becomes one where the older and poorer the technology is, the higher is the kickback that the technology giver, the vendor, is prepared to give in order to get himself accepted. And when a civil servant, or anyone for that matter, within the government circle, says, no, we don't want this technology, we want the other technology, although it's 3 times more expensive because it has much better long-term impact on India, that the person who says that and who gets that technology is then attacked as someone who's been corrupt and has taken money, and it becomes a case, and their cases, I know bureaucrats personally, and several of you do. There may even be some present here who had this fate, who have then found that their careers are wrecked by this. So today, actually, we are a technology-averse country. We just simply do not pick up on anything. And I wish I had another 5 minutes to give you example after example of this. I'm going to stop here and let you think about this and just apply this to your experience and see. Corruption, kickbacks, the destruction of technology, the destruction of every opportunity to really become part of the Asian miracle. Thank you.
I'm going to take the liberty as author of one sentence. It's not a last word. It's something that is important and arises from what Ramila said and what Neerja said. Why history matters. An important factor underlying the resurgence of Asia in the post-colonial era, and that's common across countries, for only Thailand was not colonized, that Asian countries had an embedded history of well-developed states and cultures that had not been entirely destroyed by colonialism, quite unlike Africa and Latin America. And that has been an important part of the post-colonial state in Asia. They were good, bad, ugly, indifferent, but that was important. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Thapar, Professor Gupta, Professor Jayal, and Professor Mandal. Thanks to Mr. Jha for moderating this discussion, and thank you all of you for being such patient audience. Thank you. And Professor Nayyar for writing the book. Thank you.
One group, of course.